as you know, man, when you get started, man, you end up with an amazing collection because they force you at every stage of your career
Well, I
to
wonder if clergy, coming out of seminary now will have libraries the way we do, or whether they'll
no, because
just
they
have them
have
all
so much.
electronically.
Yeah, they have so much on the internet. And so much is electronic.
Well, it appears that we are now live on YouTube, so I'll
Okay.
take a moment to say hello. I'm Rabbi Daniel Katzenberg of Beth Am Synagogue. Really delighted to be here with my colleague and friend, Dr. Al Hathaway of Union Baptist Church. And it's an honor to have our two congregations and anybody else who may be tuning in join us on YouTube, on Beth Am's YouTube channel. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to my colleague to invite us into this conversation on this really auspicious occasion celebrating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
I thank you, Rabbi. I tell you, what's interesting is that our two congregations literally almost share the same community, and we share the same kind of philosophy around community service. And we've exchanged pulpits as a testament to the Martin Luther King Youth preached at Union. I had the opportunity to share word there. Our choirs have gone and shared there, and I think it's good just to have a conversation around this rich history that the Jewish community, the black community has had, kind of a past, present, future. When we look at what's happened in Georgia, I think we are all excited about the possibilities. But I believe that a conversation right now that looks at philosophies, that look at the real practical things that are being done, is a good conversation to have on Martin Luther King's national holiday. I would say to you that I had the pleasure when I was at Coppin State now University. I was the president of the Martin Luther King Philosophical Theology Club. I created that
Pretty cool.
club, and one of the conversations that I had, I was blessed to have a gentleman. His name was Dr. Ara Zepp. Dr. Ira Zepp was a professor at Boston University and actually was one of the professors of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I brought him to Coppin and we had a rich conversation. At that time, the conversation was the beloved community as reflected in the thinking of Dr. Martin Luther King. And at that time, the moral majority that was being promulgated by my friend from Liberty University. And those two contrasting ideas are still ideas today. Are we extremely conservative in our perspective, or are we kind of socially engaged in terms of the perspectives of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King? So I just wanted to look and you give a glance because there is a famous picture that we all know of Rabbi Heschel and Martin Luther King link arms together. What did that really mean, and what is the meaning of that, and what significance can we draw from that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I love that, and I think one thing that we've really learned here in 2021 is that famous photograph of Heschel and King standing arm in arm um, in Selma really is kind of a jumping off point for conversations, right? I think too often, and we were talking about this earlier, that becomes sort of the end of the conversation, right? Heschel and King and Kumbaya, let's sing we shall overcome, everything's good, right? And I think if anything we've learned in 2021 is that everything is not good, that there's a lot that needs to be improved in the country, in the world. We saw a violent white supremacist insurgency in the Capitol just recently, people who were targeting uh, Jews and African Americans alike as really the recipient of their hate. And so using those moments of allyship as a jumping off point to talk about where were we then, what are the ways that the alliance between the Jewish community and the African American community during the civil rights era can translate to today, and what are some ways maybe that we need to sort of grow beyond it and grow through it and learn some new ways of relating to one another. We do want to let people know we're going to try to structure this, I guess, maybe past present and future, although it may be more associative than that. And we really want this to be a conversation between the two of us. This is, I will tell you, Dr. Hathaway, this is new territory for me because I'm used to like hosting people as you know, and asking them questions and facilitating, but just being in this like podcast mode where we're talking and then everybody else is just listening in is new for me, but I'm really excited to try it out with you today. So thanks for
Well,
making
I
it.
thank you too. I mean, we're trying it out. I mean, in this period of COVID, we're telling everybody to be safe. We have to make certain that when the vaccine becomes available for you and your group, please take it. But this allows us to be in conversation, but still be safely distanced at this particular time.
I do want to say to folks out there, first of all, amen to that. And second of all, if you are watching on YouTube right now and you're interested in sharing a thought or posing a question to us, go ahead and put that in the YouTube chat. We're not following the YouTube chat right now, but we have a colleague from Bethlehem, Jamie Aaron, who's going to be doing her best to relay those questions to us. We'll get to as many as we're able to. But Dr. Hathaway, maybe you can talk a little bit about not to date you or myself, but I was born really as the civil rights era had come to an end, and so maybe you can talk a little bit about growing up here in Baltimore and what that time was like for you personally.
Well, I've come to the point in my life journey now that I'm thankful for every day. So I don't have any problem with saying that I was born in 1951, and I was born right there in the 1200 block of Drew Hill Avenue, and which is the block in which the church that I serve, Union Baptist Church, is also located. So I actually grew up in the shadow of my church, and there was a grocery store there. Back in that day, you had the A&P, which we think of that food chain as a big food chain. Back then, A&P was basically neighborhood stores, and there was a Mr. Cohen who was the owner of that neighborhood store, and he was really my first contact with a Jewish. He had a young son that was around my age, and they tell me he was one of the first Jewish persons that I came to know. And it was interesting because at that time in our neighborhood and community, people knew one another. So Mr. Cohen knew my family. He knew the families in the community. The families in the community knew him. He had a kind of a credit system. So he knew that the families worked. That my father worked at Bethlehem Steel. My mother at that time worked for a hospital. He knew that we were gainfully employed, and so he would allow our families and my family and others to have credit. And you could go in and you needed the item, he'll write it on the book, and you'll take the item home and use the item for whatever your needs were. And then when it came time for the actual pay period, my father would send me down, hey, take this. This is to pay for the book for that items that we had purchased. So we had this kind of trust system in the community that was an amazing relationship, and it extended even as my family moved from the Upton community to West Baltimore to where we integrated a neighborhood called Shipley Hill, where even there was that same kind of relationship with a Jewish store owner there. But what was interesting was that after the riots, Baltimore City in 1968,
After
those
Dr.
relationships
Assassin.
changed. Yeah, the Cohens moved out of the neighborhoods. There was a new owner of these stores, and all of those relationships that we took for granted actually became relationships that got frayed and fractured. But I grew up with a very rich experience. As you know, I grew up in Union Baptist Church. That was kind of the epicenter for a lot of the struggle. And so I'm playing down in the basement, and then right above me would be Reverend Dobson and Dr. Marion Bascom. There'd be Rabbi Maury Saltzman and others actually planning, one, the desegregation of Gwynn Oak Park. They'll be planning how would we picket against a gold seeker around his practices in terms of land lease contracts. So it was always an active, dynamic, engaged relationship. One, in my understanding, a sense of trust, and then also a sense of shared experience, shared activism that really shaped my early experience. I would say to you, I knew about the Rosewall Foundation and its investment in land grant colleges and the investment that was made there. Of course, I knew during the rights movement where where the Jewish community and black community participate in the Mississippi Freedom Rides. I mean, there was always this kind of experience that I had growing up that I think we have to examine because it did not remain. It got frayed and fractured. But that's why this day is important to me. It allows me to reflect and allows me, my dear brother, to share a conversation with you so that I can hear your reflections as well.
Yeah, and I think what's such an interesting insight is that those alliances, right, the organizational, institutional alliances that you're describing, whether it was between churches and synagogues or between organizations, the Baltimore Jewish Council here and its work with the Associated Black Charities and the NAACP, you know, those alliances were made possible because of relationships,
Right.
right? You and I have a friendship. I serve a majority white congregation in a majority black neighborhood, right? And
Right. Right.
and that's a real opportunity that that existed at a time that you're describing when neighborhoods were transitional, right?
Yeah.
When African Americans were being invited into, right, because they demanded to be invited
That's
into,
right.
and then were granted the right by the courts to move into neighborhoods that they were forbidden to live in. Jews were a little bit ahead of the curve, but kind of in the same fashion, right? There's
Yes.
a time when Jews could only live in certain areas as well, and those, you know, like it's a double-edged sword, of course, right?
Yes.
The white flight
Yes.
that led to the divestment from Baltimore City also for a time allowed for more integrated neighborhoods where, you know, black folks were moving in and white folks who hadn't all fled yet were still there, including Jewish folks who
Yes.
were white. And there were some great opportunities. And then, you know, but then it breaks my heart when you talk about Mr. Cohen closing up shop and
That's right.
and leaving. And there are all kinds of reasons why individual decisions were made, but collectively, I think part of the challenge we have been in over the decades is that there's, you know, we still live in a very segregated society, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
and
yeah.
that didn't stop, you know, when the rioting simmered, you know, down,
Yeah,
right?
it's quite unfortunate when I think about Baltimore. There was an amazing gentleman who was the president of the Baltimore City School Board back in 1954. His name was Walter Sondheim. Walter Sondheim was a business leader, an amazing person, and I think about here he was as the president of our Baltimore School Board that in 1954, he said that when the decision of Brown versus Board, here's Thurgood Marshall fighting that Brown versus Board decision, and he says, I will move to desegregate the Baltimore City Public Schools. Now, here I am, not knowing him at that time. I'm just a young kid. I'm 3 years old. But what impact did that have? That impact that had was that when I went to an elementary school, I was a part of a cohort that was integrating the Betsy Ross Elementary School.
Mm.
Then when I went from Betsy Ross, interestingly, because of the tension and dynamic, the school board in record time built the school just for black students that lived in West Baltimore. That was school number 200. We went there. It was just record time. They built that school, and I ended up for a period of time in a segregated school because we were integrating Betsy Ross.
Mm.
Then my cohort moved from there and went to Gwynns Falls Elementary School. That's when I became friends and colleagues with the late Congressman Elijah Cummings, who was my seventh grade classmate, eighth grade, ninth grade, and then we went on and we then went to integrate Baltimore City College. And he was my classmate there, ninth grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, as well as 12. But here, I was a part of this movement that was integrating Baltimore City Public Schools. So all of my class members were diverse. I had a very diverse class as my educational experience. So it kind of grieved my spirit that now when I work with the local schools in our neighborhoods, that I find them resegregated again. I find them with persons from the same racial background without any diversity being a part of that educational experience. And I believe that we as a community are losing because you don't have that early time to develop relationships. Give you an example. So one of my classmates, Sandy Rosenberg, one of the amazing delegates. Well, Sandy Rosenberg and I go all the way back to 1967. You know what I mean? And to think that he comes and sits in my house and we talk and discuss policy. He shares my perspective. I share my perspective with him. But that's a rich relationship. And that's the only way we can have a society. That's why that picture of Rabbi Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King means so much, because they were in relationship. Even in their differences, there were conversations, there were places in which they intersect, and there were opportunities to share. That's one of the things that I think if Martin Luther King was here today, he would say to us, we need to be in relationship with diverse communities and diverse perspectives. That's how we become what he called that mosaic of humanity.
It's well put, and I'm curious that that phenomenon you're describing about how essentially, there's one step, right? Desegregation, the sort of legal de jure
Right.
desegregation, but then how do you keep that going? I mean, one of the things I think we know now about the failure of Brown versus Board of Education is that they integrated the students, but then they, in a lot of cases, they allowed white parents to insist that the faculty also be white. And so we
Mm-hmm.
had all of these, young African American kids who didn't have the benefit that they had had before in the segregated schools of
Right.
having teachers that looked like them and also were not, overtly racist against them or covertly racist against them. And so we ended up, now we have segregated schools again, not because the law says they should be segregated, but because policies have segregated them. And a lot of that comes from not being willing to do the hard work to ensure that these de jure changes are sustainable. I mean, another example is you told me once that you used to ride the streetcar out
That's
to
right.
Circle Gwynn Park, right?
That's right. That's
And
correct.
just and just it was heartbreaking to hear that story of your kind of going to the terminus and then turning around and coming back and watching these white kids. Well, I don't want to tell you tell the story.
Well,
Um,
I know, no, no. I
it,
mean, it's the thing about it is that people don't realize that one time we had a very good transportation system in Baltimore. We had rail cars, we had street cars, and those street cars literally would take you everywhere. Well, one of my experiences growing up, and now I'm just like 10, 11 years old, was that we would drive and the turn. You would ride out Liberty Heights, make the turn on Gwynn Oak, and then there was the turnaround there at Gwynn Oak Park, where the rail car would then come back into town. The idea is that people could debark right there and be able to go to Gwynn Oak Park. But as I was growing up, it was segregated. I couldn't attend as a child Gwynn Oak Park, and I was just as amazed and just as astounded when in 1963, really in June, July, really started around March, April, June, July 1963, they had the whole desegregation movement of Gwynn Oak Park. That really was the precursor to the Great March on Washington. That was August of 1963. And so when people were celebrating going to the March on Washington, I celebrated the simple idea that I was able to now go to Gwynn Oak Park and ride the merry-go-round. And I tell my grandchildren that my children that same merry-go-round that I rode as a child there in 1963, that merry-go-round is on the National Mall of Washington D.C. And it is still operative. Then I came to find out and had another gentleman tell me that the carousel that was there in Gwynn Oak Park has now been shipped to Hershey Park. So there's still remembrances of this amazing facility, even though now Gwynn Oak Park was gone. But I didn't think of it as heartbreaking. It was amazing. You look at it, you would say, "Wow, why can I play?" But you didn't think then that there was this institutional racism and segregation. It was just baked into the way things were. I mean, in my lifetime, I experienced the difference between a white water fountain and a colored water fountain, and it was just the way things were. Did you get angry about it? No, as a child, you didn't know that was that something could be different. But I was a part of that movement that was the change. I lived in that change generation that began to break down those kinds of barriers and make those kinds of changes. And I'm glad when I look today to see that the world that I grew up in is not the world that I live in today.
and how amazing of what was happening, how quickly things were happening in those days. At the same time that they were working to desegregate Gwynn Oak Park, Dr. King was writing his letter from Birmingham jail, right?
Exactly.
Around
Yes,
wasn't
right.
that June of 1963, I think, right, in advance of the march in Washington. And I think when I again, like, beautiful and also heartbreaking, because within a very short amount of time, right? I think a decade
Yes.
after the desegregation of Gwynn Oak Park, guess what? It folded, right? And I
Right.
think in large part it folded, if I'm reading the right history, because a lot of white folks stopped going.
Exactly.
And that's, I think, the insidiousness of racism, right? Individual racism, right? Even if you deal with some of the systemic stuff, if we're not dealing with the racist ideas, the racist, the sort of the implicit biases that people have, the sort of irrational fear, right, that causes a white family to leave an increasingly black neighborhood, or that causes a white Jewish family in Pikesville to say, well, we're not going to go to Gwynn Oak Park anymore,
Right.
because they've let them in. I mean, those stories are heartbreaking, and I actually think of the famous line of Dr. King's that he quotes frequently from Amos, right? Let
Hmm.
justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Um, a better translation of that than even, I don't know, that's probably the King James translation, I'm
Yes, it
guessing.
is. That's right.
But in the Hebrew, it's vayigal kamayim mishpat, right? So let water sort of roll like a wave, right?
Okay.
It's not
All right.
necessarily about rolling down. It's really about sort of rolling forward like a series of waves. Like, in other words, let justice be sort of just a continuing barrage, a wave after
Wow.
wave after
Wow.
wave, sort of smacking on to the shore. And then the second part of the phrase is "Utzedakah kenachal eitan," right? So, and let righteousness, or really tzedek is another word for justice, right?
Uh,
Because the Bible uses this poetic form called biblical parallelism. So it's basically restating the same thing. So
yes.
let water sort of roll forward over and over and over again in this iterative process. And then, what is a nachal? Like, stream isn't a great translation, actually, or a
Okay.
river, because there is a Hebrew word for river, that's nahar.
All
This is
right.
nachal. Nachal is actually a wadi.
Mm.
So, like, what is a wadi? It's a dry riverbed, right?
Okay.
Wadis only get water occasionally, and so
Wow.
a nachal etan
Mm.
is like a continuously flowing wadi. What would it be
Wow.
like if there was a constant rainfall, which would constantly fill all those dry riverbeds so that they would never dry up again, right? And that imagery that clearly Dr. King was going for, right? This idea of
Yes.
justice, it has to be sustainable. And I think that's kind of what we're exploring here, is how do we get to a place of sustainable justice, not just incremental victories at the ballot box or
Yes. That's
in
right.
legislation, but then how does it become, what's the next wave and the next wave, right? How does the rain keep falling so that the dry riverbed fills with water again and again and again, right?
Yeah. Oh man. See, that's why I love hanging out with you, man. The Hebrew understanding of the Bible text and the language of the Hebrew, which is closest to the original language of the text, really helps me gain that imagery, which, and that's why I'm always probing the minds of my rabbinical colleagues, because I take your language and then I come into the Baptist church and baptize it, right? And they say, "Oh man, look how deep the pastor is," But it's because it's these shared experiences and shared understandings that enriches us, and that's the basis of this philosophical theology that both Rabbi Heschel as well as Dr. King understood, to catch the big picture, the big goals, the big ideas, and then force us out of our smallness to think big. And sometimes, unfortunately, we recess and we become small again, and we become segregated, and we become isolated, and we become protectionists. We want to protect our way of life against someone else, not realizing that the way of life is that we are all together and we are all enriched, and that never ending flow of water eliminates dry spaces so that my community is not without lack because your community has abundance. Our community has a shared experience, which is what the divine intended. I think we find ourselves. I think it's important, my dear brother, that we not only have conversations like this, but we encourage the members of our collective congregations to have conversations. And if you remember, one of the rich experiences was when Union Baptist members and your members shared a meal together. And they sat around the table and had opportunities to converse one with another. They were amazed at how much synergy they had, and they were amazed at how much similarities they had. And I think that we should be proponents of dialogues and conversations. Just stop for a moment and talk to your brother. Talk to your sister. Talk to someone who's maybe from a different experiences than yourself, and you'll find out that we live in a very rich society. Yeah, we have problems, and I think I don't want to. I don't want. I don't think we should gloss over those because people need to confront some of the fears and some of the. I mean, to think that in Baltimore City, we have high incidences of violence where African Americans are the perpetuators of murders of other African Americans. How can you have a community when there's so much violence? And then we shouldn't fall into the argument that when we talk about that violence, that we then want to deflect and talk about how our country's involved in war and our country is involved in this. And but no, no, no. We have to realize that we live in neighborhoods, and neighborhoods are the building block. Families are the building block, not only of my community, but your community as well. Neighborhoods are the building block of communities. Churches and synagogues are the building blocks. And we got to understand that we have to have local communities that are healthy. And they are healthy because we work to make them healthy. And I think that if there's anything that I learned from the civil rights struggle is that we should never stop the drive to create community. And that's what Martin Luther King talked about, the beloved community, where a person was not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We've got to work every day to create the beloved community in our midst.
Mm, mm. I see there is a note put in the chat about Beth Israel Hebrew School had a free Sunday at Gwinnett Park in the 60s, Lag BaOmer, which is a holiday that comes between Passover and Shavuot. And I wonder if that's a post-desegregation. I suspect it is that she's putting it in there. And I wonder, so it's also good to know that there was Jewish institutional investment post-desegregation, if that's the story.
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious about, I feel like the elephant in the room, Dr. Hathaway, is, anybody tuning in right now must be thinking about what's been going on in America recently
Yes.
under the Trump administration, the hate that's been unleashed by this guy and his enablers, what we saw on display at the Capitol building, a reminder of the intersection of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. For those who are interested in hearing more about that, you could read a really wonderful piece by Eric K. Ward called Skin in the Game, for people looking to kind of understand, like, how is it that that white nationalists can march through Charlottesville chanting, Jews will not replace us,
Right.
as a protest measure against removing Confederate statues, right? What's the relationship between those two things? And he talks about the ways that anti-Semitism in some ways kind of undergirds and animates anti-Black racism. And so they're all related. But I'm curious, if we could talk a little bit about sort of this moment that we're in right now. What do you think? Like, how do we as a nation begin to move out of this? And how does that relate to how, I mean, we titled this this conversation about Reverend Warnock and
Yes, right.
Joel
Yeah.
Ossoff. What are your thoughts about this moment that we're in right now?
Well, one of the, race has always been the elephant in the room. It has always been the wedge issue that's used to separate one group from another, one sector, from the north from south, etc. We've always been there. One of the other parts has been a certain philosophy, and it really was born in Baltimore, where you had this philosophy of eugenics, where there was a racial superiority perspective, and that racial President Wilson, there Johns Hopkins was one of the proponents of it, along with some others here in Baltimore. Now, what happened was that that created a kind of discrimination against persons that were basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So that's what created this kind of Jews, created this Irish not apply, created this kind of color barrier. And so what has happened is that one of the blessings of my Irish brothers and my Jewish brothers is that you have a ability of if you choose to assimilate into society, so that if you don't wear descriptive garments or wear, who knows? You're a part of this broader community. And I remember I went to Hazukamuna, a synagogue. We had a conversation there, and they showed this whole timeline there on, I believe it was on their fourth floor. And it showed how these many different entertainers that were Jewish had changed their names so that they could fit in to the Hollywood scene, and it was just amazing. Well, I don't care how much I change my name, they will know that I'm not a part of that scene and community. And that was one of the dangers that I think that has happened, was that here you get the politicizing of race difference for political advantage. That was what we always fought against. And here you have, at the instance in terms of this Trumpism, using that as a birther, using that as a wedge issue with President Obama, using that as a wedge issue to get people who were basically, I would suggest, are weak-minded, to accept the idea that yes, it's the other that's the problem. It is not me, it is the other. And I think that that politicizing really got bore out to now, where you saw now president being impeached for the second time because he publicly advocated for an insurgence. And he wants to deny that he didn't, but he did. He sent people to the Capitol to to raid the Capitol, to do violence in the capital of America, to threaten a vice president and to threaten a Speaker of the House. That is unbelievable that a leader of a country could cause other people in that country to attack the very country in which they live. And I think you're right. I think we need to talk about that, because that can fuel up anywhere. I mean, that was the part of, unfortunately, the part of what happened with Nazism, was that this idea got embedded inside of the functioning and operation of government, such much so that they were able to segregate and isolate and even condemn a particular group of people. That's what can happen in America if we are not careful. And that's one of the things that I'm so glad about President Biden elect, is that he is trying to intentionally demonstrate by people in positions of prominence that we are a diverse country, that we have people from every different community that has skills, gifts, and talents, and those skills, different talents should be shared.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And you know, I mean, I don't take partisan positions as a rule, but you know, after the election, just given what Trump stood for, right,
Yes.
regardless of his party, you know, was certainly glad to see that, as has historically been the case, that both the, you know, African American community and the Jewish community, most of which is white, but you know, a good percentage of which, somewhere in the 10 to 20% of which is people of color who are Jews as well, but that there was still, you know, 75% support for Biden among the Jewish community. It's still very high rates, and yet there were a significant number of Jews, especially those who are more Orthodox Jews, who in much higher numbers supported Trump. And I actually spoke about this in my sermon last Shabbat, that you have to sort of wonder when religious, people who consider themselves the most religious, right?
Right.
Ultra Orthodox Jews, white evangelicals, then, you know, are willing to somehow kind of, I don't know, create a silo in their own consciousness of like, well, this guy is gonna, he's gonna get me more Supreme Court justices, or he's gonna
Right.
get me protection against, the and uh, the state that might be coming to sort of take away my religious liberties or whatever that means. I
Right.
frankly disagree with that, but that's the sort of paranoia. And then people are willing to sort of abrogate their own values in order to lift up somebody who acts contrary to those values
Is
all the
it?
time, right? This,
Oh,
a
yes.
slanderer, a liar, a thief, in so many ways, right? So I'm curious about, I was talking with a colleague who was talking about Dr. King and how he was, he in some ways, like, you could call him a fundamentalist too, right? Like, he
You're
was a
very much
Baptist.
fundamentalist.
You're a Baptist. Like,
Yes.
maybe you can help. Like, I would love to get your thoughts about um, what is constructive, open religion look like, and what is closed and marginalizing religion looks like, because
Yeah.
it's clearly not about having the courage of your convictions, right? Having
Right.
strong faith. We have people who have strong faith who do wonderful things like Dr. King, and people
Yes.
who have strong faith who do terrible things,
Yes.
like, some of the pastors who have supported and enabled Trumpism.
I'm like you. I try to not take my religious philosophy into partisan politics. I mean, if the truth is told, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican. I mean, though he didn't never talk about party affiliation, but I mean, he came from a very a family of means. His father was a member of a bank board. He came from a upper middle class background. He had the opportunity to have a very tremendous academic learning experience. He married a Coretta that came from a very middle class, upper middle class background. He had a value system that at that time would have been defined as a Republican value system. The challenge that we have is that, and then the beauty of his public ministry was that he never operated in that religious sphere. He didn't operate like a Republican. He operated as a bigger personality. And I think that we in our faith community need to learn from that. You can have a religious, a political affiliation. You go into the ballot box, you pull your lever, who cares? But when you talk about you're in the public arena, if you're not talking about the principles and ideas that unifies, the principles and ideas that would profane humanity as an injustice to humanity, if we're not talking about those things, then what we're doing is we're perpetuating a system that will, of its own weight, collapse. That's what we saw with this advance for racism, this advance of Trumpism, is that we saw it collapse right before our eyes, and it is collapsing now. So much so that you're going to find that one time when you went to see Trump on hotels and Trump as a sign, that's going to be one of the most devastating brands in America. I mean, I had a person send me a a garment label. It had Ivanka Trump. It was at Marshalls. It was regular price was $39.99, and it was marked down to $1. So here through this activism, this
But it's a
brand.
collector's item now. Like,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't
50
even
years
buy
from
it
now,
for a
you can
dollar.
sell it on eBay, right?
Yeah. But just to think that this political philosophy collapsed, and
Mm.
that's one of the things that I think that we who have a faith understanding, we know that wrong. It was the old poem that Martin Luther King would always recite. Truth for all on the scaffold, wrong for on always on the throne. But yet in the shadows of the dim unknown standeth God, keeping watch over his own. We know that God wants us to be better. And that's the challenge that I see that we always have, is that what do we do in our religious thinking, in our religious action, in our religious life to be about the better? And many times political philosophies play to our worst. it doesn't play to our better. And so, even though I was born into the Democratic Party, I told one of the party leaders, I said, you know what? Man, y'all ain't never invite me to the party. Where's the party? You know what I mean? I never experienced any of the joy, any of the satisfaction. I didn't blow any screamers or nothing. I mean, but I'm end up being something that I don't see what is the benefit of it. But I see the benefit in being a person of faith. I see the benefit in being a person trying to stand up for righteousness and justice. I see the benefit of a person seeking to always organize as best you can community among diverse people. And I've been enriched in my life because of that. And so I just think that we have to be very careful that we don't lock ourselves into political philosophies and ideologies that restrict us from being in relationship with all of humanity and all of our citizenry.
Folks, I want to we're going to be wrapping up in not too much longer, but if you would like to place a question in the YouTube chat, if you're following on YouTube, happy to try to address any questions that you might have. We're really glad that everyone tuned in to join us for our conversation today. I wanted Reverend Hathaway to kind of build on something you were just saying, that that there is kind of looking forward, if we kind of come to both the faith that we share, right?
Yes.
The belief in something larger than ourselves. And I heard recently, actually today, I was listening to a recording of Dr. King speaking to a synagogue in 1958, the synagogue in North Shore of Chicago. And he was talking, I was really surprised. And I think this is kind of indicative of what you were saying, right? He was very open to people's different views about God, right? However you conceptualize God, he was saying, whether you think of God in this way, or the unmoved mover as a sort of a force, whether, right? Clearly that wasn't his conception of God. He had a particular conception of God and a Christian perspective of God, but he was very open to people finding faith and a sense of something greater than ourselves, and how that informs the fight for justice. And clearly something that Jews and Christians have in common. I was really struck, you were mentioning Reverend Warnock and Joel Ossoff.
Yes.
How beautiful that is, that we have the student of John Lewis.
Oh my.
Right?
Oh
May
my.
his memory be for a blessing.
Yes.
And the pastor of Dr. King's pulpit, right? In Ebenezer Baptist Church. There is a faith. I don't know if Mr. Ossoff's Jewish faith is strong or not. A difference between Judaism and Christianity is that one can be a Jew and maybe, not go to synagogue, maybe not even believe in God, but
at least will be 2 times a year you're supposed to come to the synagogue, It's at least twice.
You're supposed to come every day, but it's true that plenty of our people don't necessarily, and they're still part of the people. But I am really struck by that notion. So I'm curious, looking forward. We do have a question here from Justin Fair, who said, "Would you please share a mantra we can carry with us today?" Maybe that's a good place to start. What do you think going forward from this moment to the future? And I also know that you've done some work organizing around getting communities of faith to advocate. You could maybe say something about that. Or...
Let's work on that, because I believe I would say this. Reverend Vernon Dobson, who was my predecessor at Union Baptist Church, an amazing gentleman around ecumenical relationships. He was a organizer. He was a theologian. He would say something that from my critical academic eye, I would critique. But when he said it and I thought about it from my practical theological perspective, it made a lot of sense. This is what he would say. He would say, either God is God of all, or God is not at all. And I should say, wait a minute, man, I'm a philosophical theologian. I could tear that up. But then when I thought about it, when we think about our faith perspectives, we all are sitting there at Mount Sinai. We may be at different spaces, still looking up at the rumbling at the top of the mountain. You know, and so I thought about it from that perspective that we are all, and this is Olin Moore. And I remember your synagogue served for a period of time there at Dr. Olin Moore's church at Mount Lebanon Baptist Church. And what Dr. Moore would say, and he was one of my friends and colleagues and professors, what he said was, it's almost like we have this elephant that we have to describe that we none of us have ever seen. And we're holding it by the trunk and saying, define that. Holding it by the ears, define that. Some holding it by its leg, define that. Some under the underbelly, some sitting on the back. And they said, now define that. And what we are discovering is that we all have pieces of it, but not all of it. But when we come together, we then begin to describe all of it out of our collective experiences with it. And that's what makes the Jewish story, as it looks at the Exodus experience, so relevant to the African American story as it deals with slavery and deals with Jim Crow and segregation. We can all move to the point that we are all moving out of a period of bondage to a point where we are going to experience the glory and freedom of God that may be in Canaan land. And so one of my favorite scriptures is and I need you to help me understand this, comes out of Jeremiah. Where Jeremiah says, hey, wait a minute, our folks is in bondage, but this is what I want you to do. I want you to build houses. I want you to plant gardens. I want sons to marry daughters and daughters to marry sons. I want you to prosper. And I want you to pray for the peace of the city so that as the city prospers, you will prosper. And many of my Jewish friends have said to me, that has been your operating mantra at points during your struggle where you found yourself subjugated by others, that has carried you through. And so I've adopted that in my own experience, that as I deal with this systematic racism, Jim Crowism, that we have a responsibility, as Jeremiah commanded, to build community right where we are. And as the community prospers, we should participate in its prosperity. Now, let me say about Ossoff and Warnock. I think that's going to be the most amazing dynamic that's going to hit the public arena, because we're going to have them as U.S. senators for 6 years. Their term will extend beyond the first term of Biden, and we don't know what may come after Biden. But you're going to have two persons who will be, one, national figures, but they will have a responsibility of local service. And they're going to be measured by the service that they provide to all Georgians. And to have them come from two different perspectives and two different religious communities, to have this overall responsibility of serving people in the deep South, those persons that were sharecroppers, and those persons that were plantation owners, those persons that adhered to the Confederate flag, and those persons that went after the Union flag. Man, that is going to be the most amazing experiment in our democracy that I think is going to bode well for the future. And I always pray their strength, because they're going to lead us into a different. You know the power of being a U.S. senator? It's only 100 of them. That's an exclusive club, and they have 2% of that club, and that 2%, along with the others, can have amazing influence in our country. I'm excited about the future.
Mm. I love that, and I'm excited about also the future here in Baltimore.
Oh yes,
you know,
yes,
I
yes,
think
yes.
there's a lot of pessimism where we ever move forward. I feel like we've got some kind of young, good energy
Yes.
in our current leadership, and some new ideas, new people involved who seem to have some good ideas about how to move the city forward. And I also think that because of what's happened on the national scene, and because of the now coming up on 6 years
Yes.
since Freddie Gray,
Oh my, oh my.
there has been a kind of uh, internal examination of who we are as a society. It doesn't mean we figured it out, but
Yeah.
I do think that we as a society are not letting ourselves get away with the kinds of stuff we were letting ourselves get away with. We talked
That's
about
true.
Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have the legacy of mass incarceration. We have the continued segregation of schools and the health disparities that we're seeing so much in the coronavirus
Yes.
pandemic. And yet, I do think there are more people, not enough, right? More still need to get on board. There are plenty of covertly and overtly racist people in this country and
Yes,
in
sir.
the city, but
Yes.
I feel like there's a growing sense of awareness and an awakening to the hard work that needs to be done to make that sustainable, right? It's one thing to pray for the peace of the city. It's
Right.
another to ensure the peace of the city. And that takes, conversations like this.
Yes.
It takes a
Yes.
willingness to get to know the other.
Yes.
It takes a willingness to be vulnerable, and to make mistakes and to learn through those mistakes, right? To say things that maybe you didn't realize was the wrong thing, and then have somebody courageous enough to tell you, you know what, like, I know you weren't trying to
Yes,
offend me,
sir.
but here's why you did. And then not being too fragile, being able to say, okay, I now understand what that means, and I can grow from that. And I have a lot of hope about that. I feel
Oh
like
man.
we're
Oh
kind of
man.
on the
Oh man.
precipice
Oh
of
man.
a better era.
I
Uh,
think so. I would say to you that's one of one of my prayers and one of my blessings is that I am I am in the hope business, and but I'm in the hope business that is hope fulfilled over against hope uh, idealized.
mm,
I want hope fulfilled. And one of the things, as you know, have been a long career as an organizer, and right now there's a network forming in Baltimore of faith communities around the idea that we will be the hub of our councilmatic districts. We will be the pulse beat of the issues and concerns that impact our people. And there is almost like a covenant agreement that's emerging where we were saying as a collective that yes, I will make certain that the people in my neighborhoods that we serve will get the best equitable service from government that is possible. And I think that sense, and I give you an example. Like today, we're going to end this conversation at 2 o'clock. Then at 2:30, I'm going to be with a group of religious leaders at the Robert Marshall Field, basically advocating that in the distribution of the vaccine, that seniors in Upton and seniors in this area that have historically been left out be included and come to the front of the line. And here's what's amazing. Just the fact that the faith community is making that statement, I've gotten calls from the state health department, from the Baltimore City Health Department, from the mayor's office. See, we have a different era now. The era now is that though we recognize that there is structural racism, we have persons that are a part of government, persons that's a part of the corporate community, persons that's a part of the philanthropy community, and persons that are in the community that are saying that we won't stand for that. We will address it, we will call it out, and we will work to ensure that it doesn't rise its head again. And that's a different thing than having entrenched kind of racism that says, I don't care if you march, I don't care what you do, I'm going to destroy you. That's not what's happening in Baltimore City, prayerfully. That's not what's happening in the state of Maryland. That's good. I think we have a unique state, a unique city that we can demonstrate to the country how you advance as people together. And I want to be a part of that. And I'm glad that you are willing to be a part of that as well.
I was delighted to receive your invitation to be a part of it, and you're being a little modest. This is really your baby, and you've put it together beautifully. And I wish you luck with the gathering at 2:30. And I'm really, I'm proud that we can find ways to rally faith in ways that are not, that aren't about working toward a theocracy, right? Because I think there are people of
Exactly.
faith who think that freedom of religion means imposing my religious values on others. And
Right.
your vision is a very different one. It's saying, look, like we are people who believe in certain basic fundamental values of human worth and of
Exactly.
equity, and we therefore should advocate as a coalition. So I'm delighted to play that role in the 7th district with my councilman James Torrance, and
Yeah.
I know you've done an excellent job of putting together faith leaders from around the city to be.
We're in every 14th district. And in fact, what's amazing is that as we were forming it and putting together, the principle of physics actually played through. For every action, there's a reaction. And so the political system is contacting everybody, calling everybody, what's going on? What's happening? Well, it's no more than us ensuring that the people that we love, the people in the neighborhoods where we serve, are being treated fairly. That's all. I mean, if fairness is the order of the day, hey, we got a good society, we got a good city.
Mm.
That's what Martin Luther King, that's what Rabbi Herschel, that's what I prayerfully Senator-elect Ossoff and Senator-elect Warnock will all be about fairness and equity in our system of governance. And I believe if we do that, we all will experience. And I like to get your Hebrew word for this. But what is the abundant life?
Mm.
We call the abundant life where you experience the fullness of God's blessing. I imagine you might have a better descriptive Hebrew term for that, and if not, I won't press you. But
Okay.
I
No,
want you
I
to.
mean, the Hebrew word for it would be shefa. Uh,
Okay,
shefa is abundance. It's also like a flow. So it's
that's
almost
it.
like what we were talking about,
That's right. The
like
waters.
rolling down like waters, right? That it's whatever the sort of the ripples from heaven, wherever heaven is located.
Oh, I love it. I love it. That's what I want. The
Flow,
ripples.
divine emanation, right?
Yes,
I
give
think
me the divine emanation. That's right. That's right. That's
yeah.
what we all desire,
Mm,
and
I
for
love
that
it.
to be equally shared.
Amen. Wow. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for taking some of this day to be in
Oh
conversation.
man, it was rich conversation. I love you and appreciate you as a brother. My best to your family. My best to your shul. I mean, I deeply respect every one of them, and I say hello and to each of your members of your community as well.
And to your community at Union Baptist. It was such a delight to be there just before we all the shutdown
It
last
sure
year.
did. It sure did.
And may it be God's will that by this time next year that we can actually
That,
gather in person again, because my congregation still talks about your wonderful choir and how
oh,
excited
we're
they
gonna
are to
do that
invite them
again. We're
back
gonna
again.
do that again. Yes, we will. And I look forward to it. And you be blessed, my brother.
You as well, sir.